Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry to interrupt lunch, but we've got more important things to do now than to finish what you're eating, I'm afraid. I'm sorry to do that, but you can have a piece of beautiful beef any day, but Mariana only today. Before we get started, let me introduce the other two wonderful panellists who are joining us up here on stage. At my far right at the end is Sam Mostyn. People who've been at our events recently will probably recognise Sam. She's been on our stage a few times. Thank you for that. Sam is a non-executive director and sustainability advisor and speaker. Her current board roles include Mirvac, Transurban and Virgin. She's the chair of CEDA Australia, and her corporate roles have encompassed human resources, cultural change, government affairs, community engagement, etc., etc. And she might be a Swans fan, but we won't talk about that too much. Next to Sam is Clare O'Neill. Clare was elected to the Parliament as federal member for Hotham in 2013 and was re-elected in 2016. She currently serves as the Shadow Minister for Financial Services and the Shadow Minister for Justice. Before entering Parliament, Clare worked in business as an engagement manager at McKinsey and is the former mayor of the Greater Dandenong and was Australia's youngest ever female mayor. Welcome, Clare. So let's get straight into it. I don't know whether to go to Sam first or Clare first. Sam, how about you? Mariana spoke about a more aspirational role for the public sector, but also having a public sector that would actually make business roar. Now, you spend a lot of time in business these days. Is that realistic? Is that what business wants? How does business respond to that sort of message?
I think what I really love about Mariana's prescription for all of us is the act of collaboration. And I think anyone in business that takes seriously the role that business can play in a society would like to have much more productive collaborative relationships with every other stakeholder in the community, and government is a big part of that. And some of the companies I'm involved with have direct relationships with governments for the outsourcing, that unfortunate term, Mariana, of infrastructure. And the good companies who do that actually would much prefer to be in deep discussions with governments about the processes and the mutual relationships. And for those of us involved in infrastructure that has a direct bearing on a customer experience, to just take a piece of infrastructure without that level of assurance about service and what's expected of a community is a missing detail. If you're not a good company and you just take that license and draw out the monopoly rent, which often happens, then what's going to happen is what we've seen in this country and elsewhere, which is consumers say enough's enough. And so the trust deficit we're dealing with in institutions, I think, almost starts where Mariana advises us to go back to. I read recently, I think it was a statement out of Europe, that trust has left town on horseback and is coming back on foot. And so it's that vision of trust just racing away because people have lost faith in all institutions, including government and business. And we're walking back slowly and having to earn that trust. And I think Mariana's comment about how we do that in partnership with government, with civil society, with the consumers that we service, is the right way for us to do that properly so that we can get back on that horse and be proud of our reputations and stand for something. So I think we used to be like that. I think in this country we had a lot of respect for government and for public policy, public service. You know, when I was at university, it was a mark of honour to go into the public service and actually be a policy maker and be involved in the public relationship with the community. It wasn't seen as a thing that you did if you didn't do anything else. And business was kind of, you went there if you had a particular interest in business, but the policy idea and the notion of creating value for the society was seen as something you could do as a smart young person in the government. And Mariana's other speeches have talked about the fact that we've turned that right around, that young, bright people don't want to go into public service. They want to go and work in a big firm and make lots of money, if that's the prescription for what success looks like. So I'm really drawn to the idea that we could do much, much better with our relationship. And good business, I think, would say that without hesitation, because it would make for a better long-term financial return for shareholders and society.
Yeah. I'm going to come back to the issue around where the public sits, because I think our political leaders have a really important role to play in changing that dynamic. But let me just follow on, Sam, because one of the things that I've heard Mariana speak to is not just collaborating for a good outcome, but also implicitly requiring businesses that the public sector is contracting to and with to be part of a mission. So if we're talking about sustainability or decarbonising or dealing with emissions and climate change, that government would require businesses that it's contracting with to actually be part of that solution as well, which I think maybe takes it a little bit step further than what you were sort of implying in your comments.
Well, I think if I step it up to the kind of moonshot mission that Mariana has described, and if our moonshots were Indigenous reconciliation and what we do with the Uluru Statement from the Heart, or what we do for a low carbon future with high productivity and good lifestyles for Australians, if they are the kind of moonshots that we're dealing with, then of course the mutuality of what we're all going to be getting out of that and what we're required to do is what the private sector, I think, would want to sign up for. What we've got instead is good parts of the private sector calling on for certain kinds of policy prescriptions, like a price on carbon or some pathway for decarbonisation, but we're all muddling around with no sense of mutual obligation, and so we're not doing it very well. And time is passing, and we're not aggregating the data and the objective and playing our part collectively. Where I think most people would want to see responsibilities and obligations on all sides, and I don't think we should leave out civil society in that discussion, because most of these kind of big mission-led projects require the civil society actors to be in that mix as well, also with obligations and opportunities.
So just so the audience knows, I'm going to ask Clare a question and then maybe have a quick chat with Mariana, and then I'm going to turn to the floor for questions. So be prepared, and also Esther with the mics. Thank you. Now, Clare, Sam's handed me a beautiful segue to you. So Mariana spoke a bit about the whole imbalance in terms of if you're doing something exciting in the private sector and you're taking risks and you fail, that's almost a badge of honour. But I've worked in the public sector and I know that the mantra is whatever you do, don't embarrass your minister, right? And so the idea that you take a risk, like forget it, because you know that the probability of it working is small and the probability that you're just going to be handed something you don't want to be handed is pretty high. But also, the segue that Sam presented was the Uluru Statement from the Heart.
Yeah.
So, all of the work that I've seen on that is that the community backs that. The community supports recognition of First Australians, yet we just seem to run into this political obstinacy on this issue. And it seems that where the ambition is lacking, and where the permission to take risk and to be bold is really a challenge at the moment, is at the political level. So how do we change that? And what's the role of politicians of all sides, even as a shadow minister, to be encouraging more ambition in the public sector?
Sure. So basically, what's wrong with politics?
Pretty much,
yeah.
Okay, and you've got 90 seconds.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, firstly, I think a lot of the things that Mariana talked about, and it's just so compelling and clear, and I love listening to your ideas. A lot of it does come back a little bit to political leadership and the way that politics functions. So I need to start with an apology. I'm sorry for what's gone wrong and how we've let you down in the last few years. Look, some of the reaction I have to what Mariana talked about is that I feel there needs to be a bit of balance in the conversation. Like, we've got a lot to be proud of in Australian public policy. We have created institutions that have led to a more equal sharing of wealth and opportunity in our country that don't exist anywhere else in the world. Like, where else in the world can you take a sick child into a hospital, get them treated by one of the best paediatricians in the world, and leave the hospital without paying a cent? That's something we can be really proud of, I think. We've got, a national disability insurance scheme, which is going to eventually, when we fix the problems with it, I hope, change the way that people with disability experiencing opportunity in this country. We've got a HEC system that makes sure that 4 in 10 Australians today who are leaving school go into our tertiary sector. So these are great things that we've done, and government hasn't done them alone. They've actually been very collaborative. So I think we're doing some things that are really exciting here. Another one that I'm very engaged with is superannuation. So we've got countries all around the world fretting about their ageing populations. And it's not as though we have a silver bullet here, but we've created a savings scheme that's helped millions of Australians retire into more comfort than they otherwise would have. And the highest performing senior players are not-for-profit organisations, profit-to-member organisations. So this is very significant, and they're investing in infrastructure and lots of other big initiatives that we need to deal with. So I don't want to be too defensive about it, but I think it's important to have a balanced conversation and accept that we actually are doing things reasonably well in some areas. That being said, you know, what's happened in politics in the last few years is inexcusable, and the policy implications are so obvious and clear. And, you know, energy policy is the great representation of it, because we are, you know, one of the most at risk in terms of the effect of climate change on our quality of life here. 20 million refugees in our region, I think actually 200 million refugees in our region. And we've got, you know, a problem with dealing with a number of thousands of refugees to our country. So there's just enormous issues there. You know, I guess I experience, like, I'm a Labor politician, and I'm obviously biased, so please take this with a grain of salt. But I feel like Labor is trying to be ambitious, and we haven't always had that quality in the Labor Party, I have to acknowledge that. But, you know, you're talking about the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Well, you probably wouldn't have read about this in the newspaper, but we've grabbed that, and we've got 4 incredible Aboriginal leaders in our caucus who are driving our response to that, and that says we have a voice to Parliament in Australia, and that we, you know, that we take those what's in that statement and progress it. And if I have to compare that to the other side of politics, as soon as the Uluru Statement hit the desk, they were saying we don't want to know about this, even though they'd initiated a process of asking Aboriginal people what they wanted, and then said, well, we don't like the answer that you've come up with. So I'm sorry to get political about that, but I do feel the same way about energy. We've got you know, we've got a climate crisis on our hands here, and we had a carbon tax in place, and whatever you may think about a carbon tax, whether you liked it or not, emissions were going up. They went down when we had the carbon tax in place, and now they're going up again. And somehow we're meant to meet our Paris goals in a canter, quote unquote, with no pathway to getting there. Whereas I believe my party's actually got a plan, and we're trying to progress it. So I just finished by saying, you know, we've been through a deep nadir in Australian politics, and I believe things are going to turn around. And I think when I talk to people in my community, I've been a member of Parliament for 5 years, I've been involved in politics for 20. There is something in the air at the moment in our country. There is a community of people here who are asking for their governments to be better and think bolder and think bigger. And I just have my fingers crossed that at the next election they elect a party that's going to deliver them that.
So let me call you back on one thing, though. Yeah. I mean, one of the big challenges, and again, when is how you enable public servants to take a few more risks, to challenge, to present, you know, really challenging advice and new ideas, which I think is happening less now. Yeah. And one of the reasons I think that's happening less is because there is a mentality on both sides that you're looking for the gotcha moments. That's what it feels like from people watching from the outside. You're looking for the moment when you can say, you spent money on that and it blew up and it didn't deliver. Why did you know? And that, to my mind, really needs to change, particularly on the toughest problems in our society. So how do we change that?
Yeah. Great question. So I think there's been a really interesting transition that the public service has gone through federally, where we had a very active Labor government in the 80s and 90s, and then John Howard came into power, and his vision for the role of government was different, and I think it was reduced. And what people who were very senior in the Rudd-Gillard government say is that when they came into government again in 2007, the type of strategic thinking and problem solving that they needed to solve the big problems they were trying to tackle wasn't really there in the public service. So you're talking about a tertiary level skill here, which is the ability to withstand and take risks. I'm talking about something far more basic, which is even just taking a complex problem like climate change and trying to disaggregate it and put forward solutions. So we are actually at a reduced point than the ideal, which is a really thriving sort of risk-taking public service, although that has its downsides, as you've mentioned. So I think that, you know, if we do see a change of government federally, one of the key challenges for us is going to be how do we rebuild a public sector that we expect to take on these problems in an environment where a lot of difficult issues have been outsourced to consulting firms, and that's just drained more capacity out of the public sector. You know, in Canberra, you see constantly smart young people moving from, one of the federal government departments and going to work at PwC, because that's where the interesting stuff is happening. And I think there's got to be some, reckoning about whether that's the right direction.
I'm winking at people who work for PwC.
Ex-consultant, I should hasten to add.
Sam, you wanted to jump in, I think?
A quick response to Claire. The comment I made about any of those big moonshots, but including the earlier statement, wasn't so much about the politics. It's about the point that Melinda made about the quality of the infrastructure of our public service. And Mariana gave a speech to 700 people who came out on Tuesday night in Sydney, to hear about good policy, which goes to your point about that, what's in the air.
Yeah.
But the oration, a CPD oration, was in honour of John Menadue. And John founded CPD, but was our most significant, one of our most senior Commonwealth public servants under successive governments across both sides of politics. And what I miss is the notion of there being a sense of government, not the political side, but government that's represented by its public servants that can move across the political dimensions, but you have built up this body of incredible wealth of knowledge and policy making where you can take risks because the infrastructure of thinking and bringing people with you is something that's trusted, and you're not worried that the next government coming in is going to get rid of you for taking that.
Yeah.
And I think if we could return to a time where our Commonwealth public servants, like many in the state governments, I think where things are more successful, can actually move beyond the politics to actually promote good policy. That's sort of what I'd be hoping for, that we're moving back to a time where we could have the John Menadue type model of really strong public servants who are also not frightened of the private sector and can do that collaboration. And as Mariana was speaking earlier, I was thinking, what's the best example of when we're all working at our best, collaboratively, using governments, testing each other, trusting each other for a mission? And for me, it was the rescue of the Thai schoolboys. So 50 countries coming together in a moment of crisis to rescue those boys. And over on the side is Elon Musk building a submarine to try and take in. Now, he probably thought that was a great thing to do, but it was a private sector alone, and it could have been anyone alone, not just private. But his response was alone, and yet those governments and those volunteers rescued those young boys in a way that I kind of think would be great around moonshot type things. So, but I really think we need strong policy makers who can take risks and
But
help
you
us.
shouldn't underestimate the power of ideas. So it's not just that, we've lost our way and policymakers, could be bolder. We're training them in a particular way. Economic theory, that market failure approach that I mentioned, also has its ramifications in an approach called public choice theory, new public management, and it's still getting taught. And it's actually gotten a lot of civil servants to worry about government failure more than market failure. And of course, in the private sector, we don't just say, oh, private is good. You want to know what's good. You kind of learn, what works, what doesn't. Again, that's the whole kind of business school, Harvard case study kind of point. And so as soon as we start, because it's not about ideology. I mean, it is about ideology, but even again, in civilized audiences like this one and not like a Tea Party rally or something in Texas, we still, have, well, I don't know, actually, I don't know these people, maybe they are. But
She's making some assumptions.
there are just such deep embedded kind of notions, for example, the word bureaucratic, we think that's bad. Bureaucracies can be amazing. They can be dynamic and creative bureaucracies. How do you build that? What can we learn from, Singapore, Dubai, even China, to be honest? Some things it's actually doing quite interestingly, other things not so interestingly in terms of democracy. But, the meritocracy that they've also set up in order to get up into high levels, I think is much better than the UK kind of Etonite, if you want, pathway, which you continue to have certain people, doing PPE at Oxford having a much easier ride. But we need a new curriculum. I mean, that's why we've personally set up a whole MPA around this, where the first kind of Stanford D School kind of cool course is all on public value and public purpose. And that requires thinking about value creation, not just public value, how to really contextualize and make a framework and a pathway for that collective creation of value, which along the way also builds up your confidence. So many of these bad deals that I often kind of illuminate, especially in the pharmaceutical industry, but not only, also in energy, come also from a lack of confidence. Obama, in a rare moment of confidence, forced Fiat, when they came to buy up Chrysler, which was in public hands because the US government bailed out not only the banks, but also the automobile industry, forced Fiat in that exchange to invest in hybrid technology. Whereas in Italy, Renzi was just asking Fiat the usual thing, what do you need? And what do you think Fiat says? So that's a stupid question to ask business, what do you need? It should be, again, what are the challenges and how can we confront them together, and what is the kind of give and take and the healthy deal to get there? Otherwise you get a very boring at best and parasitic at worst partnership.
So I'm going to turn to the audience now. If you've got a question, please raise your hand and a microphone will come to you. Please tell us who you are and where you're from. And just while the microphone's going across, that comment about the lack of confidence in the public sector just resonates with me so much. And I think I've seen firsthand so many conversations where people in the public sector are prepared to say, we know that doesn't work, we know what we shouldn't do, we know we shouldn't be doing that. But then when you say, well, what should we be doing?
Yeah.
Then everyone kind of, freezes for a minute. So question here, thank you.
So Edward Buckingham, Monash Business School. Mariana, I saw you presenting in London about 6 months ago. I went out and bought the book. I was very happy. It's a wonderful book. I'm going to try and synthesize this a little bit and then get your response. I tend to think of value creation as the difference between willingness to pay and opportunity cost. And the price sits somewhere in the middle, and that's where value is captured, if you like. So you've got value creation between willingness to pay and opportunity cost, with the price in the middle. And market failures happen when the price starts to reach the willingness to pay or go below the opportunity cost. The government obviously has a role at that point to enlighten people that things are failing. How does government do that? How does government render that market transparent?
Good point. I mean, one of the, so you know how blockchain, everyone talks about it in terms of also its ability to also highlight intermediation. I mean, this is one of the big issues, that some of these things are not just because there's an imperfection towards a competitive price, which you were sort of alluding to in terms of, rent as a almost power of a monopolistic condition of some sort of imperfect competitive situation, but rent literally in terms of unearned income, the level of intermediation that we currently have in the economy, and government itself actually increasing that intermediation in terms of all this outsourcing. So I think there's two sets of questions with it. I think would take a bit too long to go into, but I think we need to frame it in a different way, not just in terms of an imperfect competitive situation, but literally how can we reveal the almost division of innovative labor that we require for that active value creation in different spaces, and only by bringing back real attention to these objective conditions of production, which means, again, innovation, division of labor, but across the entire value chain, and that broadly based value chain. So also revealing the role of civil society. Trade unions have been fundamental when properly organized, when they were a real movement and not just kind of inculcated into their own kind of narrow thinking, were critical for that market shaping process. Capitalism would have been rebelled against, not just by the Luddites, but by lots of social forces that weren't happy with what was happening, and by fighting for things like the 8-hour workday, certain types of working conditions, weekends. That became part of that value creation process, and kind of, highlighting these different roles and how in each case they sort of lost their way, and how in the meantime, because the word value has become so captured, we've allowed a lot of this intermediation to occur. That's about unearned income. It's not about an imperfect competitive price, because I do think that in terms of imperfect competition, we sort of have the tools to reveal the rents, but that's a narrow understanding of rent.
So we had a question over here on the right, thanks.
Hi, it's Phil Noble here from SPP. I'm a consultant, but I'd have to say in recent times working with the Victorian Public Service, I've seen thinking that's way ahead of ours. And I've seen a lot of courage and risk-taking as well. But one thing I haven't seen is reward for that. And I just wondered if, Mariana, you had any perspectives on that? How do you reward the brave, courageous, risk-taking public servant?
So one thing is literally in terms of the HR practice within the public service. So you actually remind me a lot. You have to Google her, or they can Google her. Cheryl Martin, have you ever met her? She was the second director of ARPA-E, which is the sister organization of DARPA, but in the Department of Energy. She's fantastic. And she used to say, we actually measure our success in ARPA-E by how much risk we were willing to take. So if we don't fail, we're kind of not doing our job, but also how much society-wide impact our successes have. And they were the biggest innovators so far in battery storage, which obviously is not just a gadget, it has a huge effect. But then the next question is, ARPA-E, it did, in fact, take huge risks, and some of this failed, some didn't. Should it, for example, take out some equity? Should it have a different type of direct public reward beyond taxation? First thing, we should remember, taxation has changed. I don't know if people remember what the top marginal taxation rate was when NASA was founded and DARPA were founded, so just thinking of those moonshot organizations. I'll just give you a hint. It wasn't a communist in power. It was a Republican president, Eisenhower, coming from the military. Just yell out a number, some audience participation here.
47.
Double that. Over 90, 91%. So we're not going to go back to that. We shouldn't, or should, I don't know. Anyway, that was the top marginal taxation rate. That is no longer how the public return comes. Now, when we're talking about R&D, upstream R&D, I don't think any of this really matters. I mean, the return is the public good, this new knowledge. But even there, if in the meantime we've allowed the patent system to be completely dysfunctional because of this lack of confidence, so we are increasingly patenting upstream research, so the tools for research are being patented, and they're too wide and strong, these patents, then actually, even with the basic R&D, if it gets patented along the way, the state doesn't get back its return for having given a 20-year monopoly to the company, because after that monopoly is up in 20 years, that knowledge isn't diffusing. But you could also have, and this does happen with the CEFC here, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, or public bank, if you actually are set up as an public investment bank or a public investment fund, you do get a return on equity. But there the pressure should be that that return gets refunneled back in the high risk kind of areas as opposed to financing the easy stuff, because that's not the point of the public sector. But in the UK, we had a green investment bank that ended up getting privatized. Why? Not because it was failing, but it was too successful. It was making money. And this kind of ideology that, public bad, private good was like, oh, but you're making money. That must be because that should go to business, no? So unless you really think these through, also nurturing these organizations becomes a problem. But, just last example, not forcing, how do you say, conditions on public subsidies and investments could come into play. So conditions on reinvestment. This record level hoarding that I mentioned and financialization, that used to be solved by strong conditions in place. So Bell Labs, one of the most famous private laboratories in AT&T, actually came out of a deal with government that said, you have a monopoly, it's not given to you by God, but by the state, and in order to retain your monopoly status, you're going to reinvest your profits in the real economy, innovation, big innovation beyond telecoms. And AT&T, like Marchione, was like, all right, because that was the deal.
We've got a question over here on the left.
Hello, my name is Connie Lenneberg from the Brotherhood of St Lawrence. Our mission is an Australia free of poverty, and so I'm really interested in what you're saying.
What's the mission?
Australia free of poverty.
An Australia free of poverty. So you talked about moonshot missions. Now that's a big moonshot mission, and I'm interested in, the discussion around rethinking business and rethinking the role of the state. And it seems to me we also need to rethink the role of civil society, because we're sort of assumed to be the good guys on the side with a good moral view. We at the Brotherhood work very hard with business, with government, to innovate around the provision of community services, to raise issues, and we're valued for that. But when it comes to the big game, you're regarded as having one foot in the camp of really searching for unicorns, that when you talk about no child in Australia should be living in poverty, and we have 17% of Australian children living in poverty, 40% of Australian children in single-parent households, 90-odd% of which are women-headed households, live in poverty. That's regarded as something that is beyond value. Mm-hmm. So, they're people who might, or children and families who might be assisted by the serendipity of everything else working. But there's no direct value equation which sees that there's value in the investment there. So I'm really interested when you talk about, having these collective missions, how we rethink the role of civil society, not as a bit player, but as a central player. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Who's that for? For me? Okay. Sorry. So no child in poverty is, to me, sounds more like a challenge. how to transform. So missions, where they're useful is they kind of, are we allowed to swear? Or are you English or American and you're swearing? You can't bullshit, right? Like you have to be able to then say, did you achieve it or not? And if it's defined too broadly, those are kind of the SDGs, right? So no hunger, no poverty, et cetera. But really being able to then transform it into a mission. And the question is, I'd like to ask back, can you think of a mission that would also be narrow just in the sense of being able to answer yes or no? Did you get to the moon or not? The space race you couldn't answer, that Sputnik you couldn't answer. But broad enough to involve lots of different parts of society, sectors, but also civil society. So I kind of want to ask you back, is there a mission? But the other thing with civil society, I think what's critical is that civil society organizations, including trade unions, even though I don't know why they're put into this bucket of civil society, should be the places of contestation of how we define the missions. And so even the green stuff, it's not always defined very well. It often can just reward certain types of incumbents. And even areas where the public has invested a huge amount, so health, innovation, it's been captured by the pharmaceutical industry in terms of how it was defined. It's just about drugs, much less on things like diagnostics and surgical treatments, but almost nothing on healthy living. And so getting civil society organizations in that case to redefine what do we even mean by this market that the public sector then provides that investor first resort investment, but also places of conflict. Most great things happen when there is conflict, whether it's the birth control pill, the AIDS drugs, again, so ACT UP movement, very important. That was through conflict. It's not just, we're all in it together, let's think of a mission. There's going to be incumbency effects. There's going to be people who are going to, even literally get hurt. So how can you, as also the public sector, create places of trust, safe places to debate, to contest, and to have conflict? That's always been critical to the value creation process. And that's something that policymakers have a real hard time with. It means not just listening, but being able to create those. And that's, the part of China, obviously, that doesn't work too well because they don't necessarily welcome that contestation.
I think one of the other challenges too, and again, I've seen this not recently, but I think it still exists, is the way in which the cost of some of these issues is narrowly defined as well. My example was before we'd reformed disability support and having a conversation with a senior bureaucrat around the disability support pension, which for me, one of the negative side effects of the disability support pension was that it sort of handed a check to many people and said, yes, we'll look after you, but you should never expect that you'll be a contributing member of society ever again. And so when I had this conversation and said, well, we should be investing in these people rather than just paying them this pension, the conversation that was, the idea given back to me was, yeah, but it's too expensive to do that. And I said, but only if you define the cost just as the cost of the check you're handing out and not as the cost of depression, ill health, poor physical health, crime, domestic violence, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think one of the challenges we have is that people are still narrowly focused on a certain set of costs and not thinking holistically about the costs, which again also means they don't think holistically about what the solutions are. So there's a question at the back, I think. Sorry.
Can I just have a quick one to Connie? Because Connie runs an organisation that in civil society, or the social sector, is entrepreneurial and has reached out to business and to government to really play an equal part. So to Mariana's comments about that act of collaboration, I think you're showing that civil society, if it acts entrepreneurially and can sit and almost create the environment where the discussion can be, where you let your guard down and you all want the same outcome and then you play your role. I think we've come out of a world where civil society was used either as a tick for business that we're doing the right thing and then put you back in your place, or government sort of outsourcing to you the delivery of things rather than the solution of the core problem. And one of the other problems I would put at all of our feet, which it just defies me, it doesn't have any value in our world at the moment, is domestic violence. We've got entrepreneurial women's organisations who've got ideas about how we might build respect for women and stop 65 women being killed alone this year, but it's still seen as somehow that's not a value, that no one puts a value on the deaths and murders of women in this country. And so where the entrepreneurial spirit comes from civil society, the women's movement, policymakers and business, that's the only way we're going to solve those issues. And I think we've got to be brave and honour those partnerships and start putting a value to the solution rather than always thinking of it as a drag on our GDP or a drag on our budgets. But the Brotherhood does wonderful work in this regard and is highly entrepreneurial, I think.
So just a question at the back.
Keenan Jackson from ID. I also used to work in the state government of Victoria, and I can attest that there's some very intelligent people there. I'm now a consultant, but having said that, most of the public servants I work with spent most of their time correcting consulting reports, so that's part of the problem. But I'd just like to say, Mariana's speech, I loved it as well, and one of the things she touched on was changing the narrative and changing the language that is used around these sort of value concepts. And I think that's highly important as well, but I also think, firstly, how do you do it in today's society? And I think, you know, there's been a kind of sentimentalisation recently of past prime ministers, you know, Bob Hawke, natural language speaking, Paul Keating, 7:30 report, got a tons of views, and we're like, which someone could speak like that now? Barack Obama was kind of remarked for his oratory skills, and sometimes it's lamented that the current state of politicians lack that ability to think big or explain big concepts in a way that connects with people, and we get drawn into this partisan kind of short-term slogans. At a past CEDA event, I think when Penny Wong, just before Coalition took power, she lamented the fact that she couldn't get the argument of why their debt was increasing and why the importance of investment in infrastructure couldn't even get that through the media and to the general public, because it was so easy for the opposition to just rail on the debt. So how do you change the narrative towards these kind of concepts when it's easy to get combated with concept slogans or concepts that are considered to be norms within society?
So if we just take for a minute the rise of populism too, I think partly, or I shouldn't make it so, simplistic, but there's been a failure of progressives worldwide to have a narrative on what sometimes is referred to as the pre-distribution agenda. No? So if at best what progressives are about is redistributing kind of wealth, as important as that is, we should always fight for example, for a progressive taxation structure and different issues around redistribution. It doesn't actually excite. So part of it is having, the historical facts of actually showing that so many things that people think actually came just out of business or entrepreneurship were actually outcomes of a collective investment, both in public organizations, but again in civil society organizations. But the next thing is to make sure that those terms are reflected then when there's these struggles and conflicts. So Obama, when he got Obamacare, which got completely watered down, but at least it was something, he didn't have the words to defend it. At best, what he said when he was attacked by, again, the Tea Party, who said, you're meddling in our health care, at best he said, it's the right thing to do because 60 million people are uninsured, and this is kind of our redistributional agenda, which is a good answer. But the first thing he should have said was, meddling? We produce 75% of the drugs that you buy in the pharmacies, 75% of the research that goes into the new molecular entities with priority rating, so the really new ones, not the Me Too drugs, come from publicly funded actors. And so that already changes the discussion. It's not that you win the argument like that. It's still going to be an argument. But the degree to which the Tea Party, again, I keep using them just in terms of this kind of extreme, which then in every country will be of a different level, right? Because you still hear, again, civilized people talking this way of, that somehow government's just important for redistributing, not for creating. Those words need to be both in the vocabulary, but they also need to be in how we measure, right? So the treasuries should be able to use and think about dynamic evaluation metrics that go beyond cost benefit and net present value. If what you're trying to do, for example, is the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, that's been really important in not only documentaries about giraffes and fish, but also in terms of great soap operas and talk shows. If we have this really narrow view of the market, then what happens is that when they get reviewed and evaluated, they're told year and year again, it's fine to do documentaries and high quality news, but none of that other stuff, that's for business. When actually in doing the documentaries, the soap operas and the talk shows in the way they did, always questioning, we have to do it through public value. Public value is a process of pushing the frontiers of these different areas. Then that's actually how they live and how they talk, but the Treasury has no idea how to measure that. We also don't know how to measure spillover. So the Concorde plane, it's not flying. So that would be a private sector failure. But for the public sector, all the investments that went in that then spilled over in terms of all these other areas that those investments had impact on, no one has ever bothered measuring that, because that would require a much more dynamic set of evaluation criteria that actually reward the kind of things that were asked there before, which isn't just the failure, but literally the unintended consequences and positive spillovers across an economy. It's amazing we have no idea how to capture that.
So Claire, go on, Claire.
Can I just, I think you ask a really great question. It's a really important one. And just thinking about, some of the big ideas in what Mariana's written books about, I think we are really struggling to translate that into how we do government in Australia, and there's a good reason for that. It relates to how we describe our own economic success. So we're now 27 years uninterrupted economic growth, probably the longest running economic growth in modern times of any country in the world. So it's a pretty remarkable achievement. And people usually talk about Hawke and Keating and opening up the economy and floating the dollar and that sort of thing. And what they forget is that Hawke and Keating did all this other really important social reforms. Like during the life of that government, the Year 12 retention rate in this country went from about 40% to around 75%. Like that is remarkable, because they changed the economy and then they made sure that people could keep up with it. So that's really important. But I think the public discussion about the government's role in the economy in Australia for a long time has been, we set the ground rules, we have good laws, we have good institutions, and then government just gets out of the way, and that's the best place. But that's not what's happening in our country, and it's never what's happened in our country. So I think government spending in Australia at the moment is somewhere around 37% of our GDP. How can we pretend that the government is not making enormously important strategic decisions about how and where our economy grows? But governments have never wanted to be bold and say, this is our economic strategy, because no one believes that the government should be doing that. So here we have government spending almost 40% of our GDP, and the government can't tell us what is the strategy here. And as we used to say in consulting, if you don't have a strategy, it doesn't mean you're not making strategic decisions. You're just not making very good ones. We're deciding to build a road in Gladstone, not Geelong. That's got an economic impact for the people that live in those two regions and the whole shape of our economy.
Follow up on that and challenge it, just to really get to the heart of this.
Go ahead.
So no strategy, yep, big chunk of money being invested. So are you saying that it's not being well invested because we don't have a strategy, or are you saying that we actually don't do a good enough job of actually acknowledging it and identifying it and talking about it, or is it both?
So I wouldn't say that there's no strategy. I think that's not to be quoted in a newspaper, please, for any journalists in the room. I think there's definitely strategy in some areas, but I think if we acknowledge that this is really important and it really matters and it might be the most powerful impact the government has on the economy, how can we do this better? That would be a great place to be, and it doesn't feel like we're quite at that place yet. I just want to make one really quick comment about the more day-to-day problems that I experience in my life as a politician. I'm just thinking about, you mentioned that Penny Wong had talked about the difficulty of getting big ideas across, and there is a media issue involved here, which is just the deterioration of resourcing of serious journalism in our country. And you see that in a very physical way in Federal Parliament House, where we historically had a press gallery teeming with journalists who were specialists in their area of policy, and they've been replaced by people who must be generalists, because that's the only way that newspapers can survive these days. The accountability is reduced, but the ability to convey important things is declining too. So there is an answer to this. Just think about the last state election we just had in Victoria. The big idea out of that election is the circular rail, right, around our city. What a huge thing that the state government's planning to do, and it's long term. It's revolutionary for the people that live in our city. They didn't give it to a newspaper. They went to social media, and that went like wildfire right around the state. So there's a possibility here because there's people interested, and the old mediums are not working anymore, and we just have to get better and more creative about using the new ones.
So, Sam, I'm going to flip a question to you, and it's a slightly unfair one because I'm going to polarise it. But do you think we'll reach a point in time where business stands up and genuinely applauds the public sector and government more generally, even if they don't necessarily agree with the specific policy, but accept that it had broad public support and all the rest of it?
Well, you'd have to say that that would presume that business has a social license to actually stand up and be critical or otherwise of others. So we're starting from a fairly low base generally, particularly for big business Australia or the finance sector more particularly. So let's presume we're in a world where trust has been restored, great business leaders are doing the right thing by the society, customers, employees. Then in that world, in the world I think there are some very good companies today, I think that's the natural home of where good leaders looking across sector do actually applaud good policy and call for good policy and call out really great policy makers and great bureaucrats. Because I think that's part of the deal, is to try to and to acknowledge that the private sector and business often does not have all the answers. It has often a great access to capital and to markets and to customers, but it's often really would love to have a much deeper relationship with good policy thinkers. And my comments earlier about public servants wasn't, I did carve out state governments, because I think state governments have done a very good job in terms of policy development. At the Commonwealth level, I think business would be cheering for an engaged discussion on the big issues of our time, and if that policy met what business sees through their customers and employees, I think we would all be we all be shouting great success. I think that's part of the deal we've moved into, and part of the reason we've all lost trust in institutions is we've not actually admired each other's strengths. We've just pulled down each other's weaknesses and we've played the polarised world, and we've used the media to do that without the proper journalism that's supporting. So we're in this contested world rather than one where we actually collaborate and admire each other for our strengths.
Now, questions? Oh, right at the front, John.
John Thwaites from Monash Sustainable Development Institute. Clare wrote a great book about 2 years ago, Two Futures, about some of the big challenges that we face in Australia, like climate change and digital revolution. But Mariana said that beneath these big challenges, we have to set missions that are more specific. Excuse me. And I'm wondering, Mariana, and perhaps Clare as well, how do we set those missions? Who sets them? And what's the priority that you use, given that there are so many things to be done as part of government?
So, just coming back to that Treasury point, I don't think it's the Treasury, obviously, that would set the mission, but they do have to evaluate it. That seems like a quick point, but it's really important because they often do get put in the position that they're evaluating a strategic case for something. But that's different from an economic case than a financial case, and they should explicitly remind other parts of government that the strategic case actually should be how you win the election. You know, whether you do want to do the moonshot, whether you care about a green transition, that should be the big political discussion. And then maybe some of the nitty-gritty of how, to set up institutions and how to, do some of the projects can, come to the Treasury in terms of evaluating which one makes more sense. But that's just a big misunderstanding, I think, of what the Treasuries are for. In the missions that I mentioned, just kind of that moonshot and the Energiewende, two totally different ones. In one case, it was top-down. It was a politician who set the moonshot. In the other one, it was, as I mentioned, civil society that actually demanded change, demanded a sustainability and a green agenda, and a politician who was able then to harness that. But the question is then, I think, how do we really have that stakeholder engagement to collectively create these missions? So some of the missions we've been working on in the UK with this industrial strategy actually have to do with care. And obviously at the table should be the people who are actually doing social care and the nurses who've seen also what it means to have an NHS, because we also, I don't know what I am, I'm Italian, grew up in America, now I'm in the UK, probably gonna get kicked out soon. There's also an NHS, but the problem with NHS, which is free, you go into a hospital, everything's free, but the public-private partnership, because there wasn't a strong public direction for how the private sector came in, right? There's a lot of PFI schemes and private initiatives in the healthcare system, but when they were allowed in without a strong public direction that was really clear on what kind of strong principles we want around the healthcare system in recent years, that public-private partnership really ended up sort of failing, and this is kind of the history behind the PFI schemes. So that's sort of also a separate point, which is how do you keep setting a strong direction, which should be also, again, contested in terms of how, do citizens want free healthcare? Do they want a publicly funded education system, which I was quite astounded here, just how increasing the trend is towards private education, even amongst people who consider themselves to be progressives. But I think the quick answer is you need stakeholder engagement, but that doesn't just happen. We can talk about collaboration, but unless you really think that through, how do the nurses, how do the social care workers come to the table where you have both the business but especially the government leaders, in this case with the industrial strategy, formulating that care mission around, for example, the aging problem, then it's all just talk. But I think we shouldn't forget that the political process itself is how, lots of these discussions, that is how politicians should be winning elections. Even to say, you will have a mission-oriented industrial strategy, we will set priorities around green transitions, we will tackle the social infrastructure for care, and then at the table and how to do it, how to set it in a way that makes sense and isn't captured along the way by certain industries or certain even government actors or academics. We capture things all the time. It really requires careful stakeholder governance of those interactions. I don't know if there's examples maybe.
It's definitely the question that's on my mind, as you can imagine, John, hearing about these really exciting missions, and that's, it's so incredibly motivating to just think that we as a community could be striving towards something. And we've got some things on the table, I think, with regard to climate change. We've got good targets around renewables and emissions and that sort of thing, but I think that sense of real excitement about an innovative idea that we're going to strive for together as a country. Two just quick thoughts. I'm just thinking back to when I used to work at McKinsey. The studies that were most successful for us were always the ones where the staff came up with the ideas because they actually implemented them at the end of the study. It's really important for people to be engaged in building these sorts of big goals that we might have for a country. But I also think, in an entirely contradictory manner, that this is about political leadership, and there is a thirst here for political leaders to be clear about what they believe is important for the country and to lay out a mission for the country. And it almost doesn't have to be perfect, and not everyone has to agree with it, but my sense with the public is that the deep-seated sense of frustration is the feeling of drift, that we are, after a period, we're not really going anywhere in particular, and that has to change. So I think that's a political leadership problem.
And I think
I'm sorry, Sam. I'm conscious that we do have to get Mariana onto a plane, so I will stop you there.